So I'm going to just jump right in. As I'm sure, can everybody hear me first of all? Yes, okay. As I'm sure we're all quite aware by now, on May 2nd, a draft opinion of the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision was accidentally leaked from the United States Supreme Court. And it kind of seems as if we're all just patiently sitting around waiting for Roe versus Wade to be overturned, or at least that's been my perspective and experience here in Denver, where the movement for reproductive rights has mostly been led by NGOs and dominated by liberal ideology so far. And this decision is actually the culmination of decades of attacks by the Republican Party and complacency by the Democratic Party. And when the decision is overturned this summer, we will very likely see over half of the US lose the right to an abortion. And 50 years of reproductive reforms will instantly be clawed back by an institution of 9 unelected elites at a time where only 30% of the American citizens support Roe's overturn and 60% of Americans support abortion in all circumstances. Not just rape or incest, all circumstances, which is profoundly undemocratic. And reproductive rights weren't even a partisan issue up until Nixon's re-election campaign strategy in 1972. In fact, abortions fell in line with the Republicans' views pretty well before this. They didn't want social welfare to pay for unwanted pregnancies, and reproductive autonomy fell in line with the Republicans' ideology of individual freedoms. The Republicans used abortion rights as a campaign tenet to gain social conservatives and Catholic voters in the South after the political backlash that they received from the progressive movements of the late 60s and early 70s, so the civil rights and feminist movements. And they kind of framed this within the guise of morality and a family values style campaign for Nixon's re-election. And the strategy was highly effective for them. They received something like 35% of the Democratic vote for Nixon's re-election campaign. So they've kind of stuck with that because what works, works. And so kind of embedded with that same ideology are some serious racist, xenophobic, and misogynistic imperialist and colonial ideas that have attempted to cross class lines and gather working class voters into their base and further divide the working class in general. An anti-life ideology is very racistly centralized around the white evangelical Christian communities anyway, and goes hand in hand with the very same replacement theory featured in the manifesto that the Buffalo, New York mass shooter wrote and prominently featured in Tucker Carlson's nightly programming on Fox News as well. And it's very, very clearly focused on the reproduction of white Christian babies while closing the borders to immigrants of a certain color. The right wing of both parties would love more than anything to conduct violence on marginalized populations without recourse. But Republicans have been working toward these ends for decades. In fact, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has even suggested legislating Roe's overturn into law should it become official. So they're clearly emboldened by having their chess pieces on the Supreme Court and other powerful positions and by the upcoming overturn of Roe. But the Democrats have had control over the presidency and Congress 5 times since Roe versus Wade was decided in the Supreme Court and have done nothing in that 50 years to codify reproductive rights into legislation. And during Obama, they even had a supermajority and did nothing. And their latest futile last-minute effort, the Women's Health Protection Act, was blocked by a no vote from one of their own senators. And the Senate, also a highly undemocratic institution. So the Democrats don't really want to protect abortion rights either, and that's because it's leverage for them. They can use it as a carrot at the time of elections and get people to vote for them and retain their powerful positions in legislature and Senate and everything, and then do nothing when they get elected. And if they were actually to do something, they would lose that leverage. Also, they don't want to risk isolating the anti-abortion sector of their party or risk the destabilization of capital. And both the Republican and the Democratic parties are capitalist parties in the United States. And so the restrictions on reproductive rights didn't start with the right or Roe. The issue was contentious prior to Nixon's election strategy, and there was a struggle for Roe that led up to that decision. And it's certainly true that the ideology of morality and religion is firmly held among the members of both the Republican and the Democratic parties and surrounds the controversy around abortion rights. But these attacks are rooted in women's traditional roles as caregivers that were formulated at the dawn of class society. And so at the heart of all of this is women and pregnancy-capable individuals' oppression in order to exploit for capitalist accumulation. Reproductive labor is traditionally unpaid or tasked to workers in some of the lowest paid professional roles, but it's the necessary labor required for raising, educating, training, and preparing the next generation of workers for the workforce. Capitalists are getting like the discount of the millennia because of this necessary labor being performed for free or on the cheap. A lot of it is publicly funded services even, and we all know how taxes work here in the US. So businesses are basically getting out of investing into their own labor pool because that's already been taken care of primarily by women and pregnancy capable people, often in addition to working their regular paid jobs. And so that's like an epic grift. And for centuries, this socially fabricated obligation has been viewed as tradition, as we, women and pregnancy capable people, are trying so hard to break with tradition. Pregnancy capable individuals are constantly and violently being relegated back to these oppressive molds with roots in capitalist accumulation. And it would seem that the ruling class is very much invested in controlling reproductive autonomy as an extension of its power, creeping all the way from the production floors into our homes, using our bodies as the vehicles for more profit accumulation, keeping us bound to these traditional molds as we desperately try to break out and seek some sort of progress. Pregnancy capable persons constitute around half of the American workforce, as well as the population, and even larger portion of the social reproductive workforce, which makes us a force to be reckoned with, and it scares the shit out of the ruling class and the right wing. And we have the numbers to make demands for better wages, better working conditions, free childcare, healthcare, and all types of political and social demands that could enhance the lives of millions, especially if these demands were ever to be made in solidarity with our male and trans counterparts. However, these demands would all be in direct contradiction to capitalist accumulation. And so under capitalism, reproductive rights will never be safe. There may be periods of relative stability, like we've seen for the last 50 years, during which we had the highly regulated, constitutionally protected right to privacy. However, the assault on the right to an abortion will always be available to relegate and oppress these individuals. Under capitalism, these individuals will always be oppressed, as there will always be opportunities for discrimination by the state, in society, and in workplaces, just for existing with certain body parts. Capitalists can justify lowering wages, not just for us, but for the entire working class in general as a whole, using us as a scapegoat. Just because of the fact that we exist. And this is no matter how many liberal legislative acts are passed. The only way to have complete equity in this case would be a transition to a communist program. But I think that we're willing to fight for unabridged reproductive autonomy as a welcome reform towards equality in this case. In the chaos of capitalism, we're torn between needing reproductive capable people for both their roles in social reproduction and production. And as Lise Vogel points out this contradiction very succinctly when she said, from the point of view of capital, the social reproduction of the workforce is simultaneously indispensable and an obstacle to accumulation. So the ruling class will always attempt to rationalize its own contradictions, sometimes even by making concessions, some welcome and some not. You know, maybe through European style investments in social welfare programs, or maybe suggesting that we open the borders to allow migrant workers in. But all of this will be contradictory to the capitalist goals of accumulation to some degree, and therefore every single reform that they give us is in danger of being clawed back.
So, yeah, thanks, Mary, for kicking that off. This question of like how we actually got to this this situation here. And one moment. Okay, and yeah, so women have been oppressed for centuries. Can't blame this all on capitalism. And in many societies, even for millennium. However, capitalism has exacerbated women's status, but how did they become oppressed in the first place? And what do trans and queer people have to do with this? If you ask a radical feminist, and that's radical in terms of going to the roots, not as in extreme or far left, the answer would likely involve patriarchy, or like an innate, unchanging, monolithic, male or masculine need to dominate and oppress, especially when it comes to women. Excuse me. Were this truly the case, women's best bet might just actually be to join the lesbian separatists, completely remove themselves from male society. Whether or not trans women would be allowed to join them would depend on just how far the radical feminists in question took the unchanging part of that analysis. The non-exclusionary radfems might give us a pass. You know, we're renouncing our maleness, removing that nasty testosterone. Or maybe we're just born with female brains and otherwise male-ish bodies, so you're good. The trans-exclusionary radfems, however, as the term states, would give us no such benefit of the doubt. Male is male, we can't escape that. So we must be trying to gain entry into their spaces for nefarious purposes. If you think that sounds bleak as hell, with half of humanity irrevocably bound to oppress the other half, I agree. Aside from flipping tables and preemptively oppressing men, or just getting rid of them entirely and switching to artificial insemination, I'm not entirely sure what route forward there would be for women's liberation, or even how we would get to such a route. Any radical feminists in the crowd who could fill me in on that after the conference, though, please? Sure. And if this also sounds like complete bunk, fortunately enough, it is. Not just because we find the TERFs morally reprehensible, not just because, you know, even physical sex is a is more of a continuum and a spectrum. Note, this is not saying that physical sex is socially constructed. Only the binary categorization thereof is socially constructed, I would say. But contrary to the slogan against the TERFs that it's nerf or nothing, there is plenty of room to argue for historically and materially grounded analysis of gender depression, i.e. that it is rooted in the gradual and contemporaneous rise of settled agriculture, class society, and heritable property. Frederick Engels talks about this at length in his 1884 book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, based on a fleshing out of Marx's notes on Lewis Henry Morgan's book from the previous decade, Ancient Society. While some of Origin's factual details and predictions, not to mention some rather Victorian prejudices on Engels' part, have been superseded by subsequent scholarship, just like the discovery of modern genetics has enriched, rather than discrediting Darwin's theory of natural selection. The basic thrust of Engels' historical framework has fared remarkably well in the face of modern anthropological discoveries. One thing that we know from this framework is that gender in hunter-gatherer societies was little more than an early division of labor, and it lacked the oppressive and coercive aspects that would appear later. Men and women may have had different spheres that they generally occupied, yes, but both were of similar dignity. And aside from literal pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing, the bodies filling these roles weren't even so rigidly and exclusively just phallus hunters and vulva gatherers and child rearers. And in a society where having too many children could actually be detrimental for the tribe's survival, women who weren't currently pregnant or nursing could go on hunts with the men. Or if all the women were busy with something, men would gladly step in to take care of the children, and there was no societal shame around this. The whole community took care of the whole community's children. Society did change, however. As humans developed and improved settled agriculture, they started being able to have actual surpluses for once. As these surpluses grew, so did a separate group of people whose role it was to manage and keep track of them. And with such divisions in society growing and turning into separate social classes, it became more important to know whose children were whose. Who would inherit that extra bit of wealth, especially in areas where men were doing the managing while women were rearing larger numbers of children, because agriculture both can support more children than hunting and gathering, and they needs more to work in the fields. When the tracing of inheritances switched from the mother's line to the father's line, property men then needed stricter control over women's sexuality in order to ensure that their children were in fact their children. Engels refers to this as the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. This degraded the position of women. This degraded position of the woman has gradually been palliated and glossed over, and sometimes clothed in a milder form. In no sense has it been abolished. And throughout the history of class society, and to this day, ruling classes have used, these, one-time but no longer egalitarian gender visions to ensure that the production of the labor force among the exploited and oppressed class, and to ensure heirs in their own class, and especially under capitalism, use this divide to, drive a wedge in the laboring classes, put them into self-destructive internal competition. So where do trans and queer people fit in this, though? People who we might nowadays call transgender have been around for a long time. From two-spirited people among the First Nations of Turtle Island, to the Hydras of the Indian subcontinent, to the likes of Joan of Arc and other notable cross-dressers in Europe and the so-called New World. Different societies have treated gender variant people in different ways, and what it looked like also varied, with the details of particular societies' gender construction. Some condemned us, other societies viewed us as good luck or even magical. I want to live in a society like that. But with the rise of the capitalist mode of production, and with its especially brutal export to imperial colonies, this traditional acceptance started to come crashing down. As for non-trans LBG folks, there wasn't always actually a solid line drawn between the two categories, especially in the late 19th and parts of the 20th century. But there's a massive historical record showing that people have been hooking up with others with the same genitals since time immemorial. The fact that it even warranted a mention in the third book of the Bible, it shows that, yeah, there was stuff happening at least as early as the Mediterranean Iron Age. And I'm sure there are examples from earlier. That said, the gay identity as we know it now is only a couple of centuries old. As capitalism's enclosure of land forced people out of the countryside, it concentrated them together in unprecedented numbers. And with that came more opportunity for same-sex liaisons and experimentation, especially for women who are now outside of the peasant home. As Mary's talk pointed out, capitalism needs babies, but capitalists don't want to pay for them. Capitalists individually need to squeeze all the profit they can from their workers, lest they be outcompeted and driven under by other capitalists. And that means paying the bare minimum they can, or the bare minimum they can get away with, and still have the workers come back to work the next day. And for the capitalist class as a whole, it means that they need to be sure there'll be enough workers to replace them when they die or are just too worn out finally. In most capitalist societies, this means forcing workers, especially women workers, to do a lot of unpaid labor in the home. Women having control over their own reproduction, however, throws a wrench into this process, whether it's through abortion or even just simple contraceptives. Trans people's very existence in the public eye can potentially call into question the very legitimacy of such rigidly prescribed and segregated gender roles. And cis gay sex doesn't tend to make babies either. So at the same time that opportunities for same-sex relationships were booming and people were leaving old gender roles in the countryside, capital's contradictory need to repress away the effects of their industrial revolution also grew. Okay, I'm at 10 minutes, it looks like, good. In the wake of World War I, as the, fast forwarding a bit, in the wake of World War I, as a product of the revolutions and workers' uprisings that actually ended the war, more space opened, for flourishing of same-sex love and transgressive gender presentations, like even out in public. In Russia, the fledgling worker state scrapped the entire Tsarist legal code and conspicuously and intentionally left out any criminalization of homosexuality. The first time this has happened since the Great French Revolution more than a century previous. Women's rights in general also surged forward. Divorce was legalized, and many social reproductive functions were brought back into the public social sphere, like public laundries, food kitchens and the like. In Germany, Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Wissenschaft, basically Sex Study Institute, even performed some of the first gender affirmation surgeries and was actually starting to tease out the difference between sexual attraction and gender identities. Sadly, however, this opening for LGBTQ and women's rights had its limits and it didn't last. In Russia, thanks to counter-revolutionary international siege and civil war, the working class was decimated, the economy had collapsed, and they simply didn't have the resources to sufficiently implement all the stuff I mentioned earlier. In Germany, the defeat of the workers' revolutionary movement and failure to form united fronts to defeat fascism led to many of the communists and the LGBT folks wearing red and pink triangles respectively in the concentration camps. And as a side note, that famous Nazi book burning picture was in fact Magnus Hirschfeld's library. That was a huge loss, I will say. And in isolated Russia, the bureaucracy, was increasingly disconnected from its original class base, which, as I said, was decimated, and was sliding further into counter-revolution. And to protect the bureaucracy's newly forming class interests against Western market capitalism's encroachment, they needed to industrialize, and the counter-revolution needed babies. I think we can see where this is going. Thus they recriminalized homosexuality and abortion. After World War II, gay rights struggle was in many ways, focused on trying to gain respectability. I mean, yeah, it was tough times then, but this started to change, like largely amidst the ferment of the late 1960s. And then on a late night or early morning, June 1969, New York City police raided a well-known gay bar that they'd raided many times before, but this time the gays had had enough. And led front and center by a line of drag queens, they fought back, and oh, was it glorious. And again, fast forwarding a little bit, again, like the struggle has continued since then, but due to various influences, including, some of the, trans exclusionary radical feminists and other influences too, that I mentioned before, trans rights have often been sidelined or used as a bargaining chip to be traded away in return for passing gay rights protections. Take example in New York State, the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act was passed, but the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act was stripped out and only passed after further struggle years later. And of course, not everyone who espouses TERF talking points about trans women trying to assault cis women are reactionary feminists. And as a side note, if we really wanted to do that, we wouldn't transition. Transition is difficult. It's easier to become a cop. Now, back from the digression, I don't know whether J.K. Rowling has seriously studied, such offshoots of second wave feminist theory, but I'm sure the right-wing talking heads haven't. A joke that it's only TERFism if it comes from the radical branch of feminism. Otherwise, it's just sparkling transphobia. And wrapping up, though, I will say that those transphobes who fancy themselves feminists are shooting themselves in the foot, or shooting their feminism in the foot. If this capitalist state can attack trans people's bodily autonomy and our right to transition, they can attack abortion too, on the same grounds. And they have. We've seen those in parallel. And they're also doing that with, they're also, trying to roll back gay rights that have been won as well. And as hinted in the leaked draft opinion, birth control just plain old regular birth control may be next. So we can't afford to have these struggles separated. They need to be united together. We need to unite the whole working class, for everyone's bodily autonomy, everyone's rights. We need to get rid of this system for good.
Thanks so much. And thanks to Mary and Noelle for those excellent contributions and posing some important theoretical and political questions to ground this discussion. And then, yeah, there's so much to unpack. I'm really excited for the Q&A. But I want to use the short time that I have to build off of the political analysis that they presented, sort of in an effort to characterize the reaction to these attacks so far and pose some questions about what comes next in the fight for abortion rights and trans rights in this moment in the fight against oppression more generally from a revolutionary perspective. And the fact is, because just as background, the fact is, given in many ways, multi-class social movements have, in the aftermath of a long process of the gutting and the defanging of the labor movement in the US, these social movements have been a locus of struggle that are able to capture the discontent of a new political generation. How socialists relate to them is a critical one, right? In the sense of winning over the most advanced sectors of those struggles to the fight against capitalism and for a different type of society, of putting forward a program to that end, and crucially pushing for the working class to intervene and organize as such in those movements with its own methods, linking the labor movement and the social movements around an independent working class perspective that neither dilutes its strategy nor remains to the side of these struggles against oppression. But before I get there, I want to begin by talking about the political terrain a little bit, building off of what Mary presented so succinctly and wonderfully, which is that we're facing a context in which the right is advancing an attack on democratic rights that is stronger than in the last several decades. Not just the right to an abortion, but attacks on the rights of LGBTQ people, particularly attacks on trans youth, attacks on teachers and the teaching of history of slavery and racism in schools, and on the right to vote as well. Contradictorily, the era of neoliberalism was marked by the advance of some social rights, particularly for LGBTQ folks, but this came in coordination with the worsening living conditions and attacks on the working class and poor more generally. Now we see that dynamic gradually being reversed as the failed project of neoliberalism gives way to crisis after crisis, and US imperialist hegemony continues to decline in ever more convulsive ways. These attacks have accelerated, of course, just months before the midterm elections, in which the political crisis that has marked the US regime for over a decade will be in full view. With these reactionary policies at the center of the debate, the elections will be a barometer in many ways for the continued influence of Trumpism in the Republican Party and for the struggle for influence between the traditional leadership of the Democratic Party and its progressive wing. And of course, the fact that the decision was leaked at all, something unprecedented in the modern history of the Supreme Court, shows exactly the level of crisis that faces the regime. And it dealt a severe blow to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and the Democratic Party. But the overturn of Roe v. Wade marks the most concrete and drastic attack on reproductive rights to date, and one that, as we all know, could pave the way for the rollback of many more democratic rights that have been at least nominally established. This onslaught, of course, has accelerated in recent years, mostly in response, I think, to the emergence of Trumpism on the political scene. And while the right is advancing these attacks to appease its base, as Mary said, we can't underestimate the complicity of the Democrats, who have historically used abortion to mobilize people to the polls every election cycle and contain discontent. And here I want to turn to the question of the reaction in the streets, since this is relevant to those of us here who realize that an independent mass movement, free from the Republicans and the Democrats, free from their allies and the NGOs and the unions, is the only way to protect the right to an abortion, to protect trans rights, and fight against attacks on all of our rights. In this context, the mobilizations and protests of the leaked decision have been some of the biggest in the Biden administration, but of course still relatively small across the country. The biggest demonstrations are taking place in cities like New York, where the right to an abortion is safe post Roe v. Wade. And even though over 64% of people in the US support Roe v. Wade, that support has remained relatively passive and has been able to be contained by the traitorous traditional leaderships of these movements, misleaderships of these movements in the Democratic Party, and again, the NGOs and unions. And so to that end, and like in line with this, in light of the overturn of the leaked decision, the Democrats haven't mobilized their base in the streets to protect abortion rights as they did when Trump was elected in 2016. It's increasingly unlikely that they'll do so even after the decision is leaked, though of course the situation is still open. For their part, the reproductive rights organizations such as Planned Parenthood, the Women's March have called for mobilizations, but aren't calling for the defense of Roe v. Wade either. Instead, they're waiting for the decision to be overturned, and their solution is simply to mobilize to the polls to vote for Democrats in November and to ask for donations to bring people seeking abortions to states where abortion will remain legal, or to collect funds for abortion pills. And as always, the line of the rule, and this shows, of course, that as always, the line of the ruling class is to treat every crisis that it creates as inevitable and redirect resistance to stopgap measures to treat the worst of the symptoms while, of course, obfuscating their real cause. Nevertheless, what has emerged since the leaked decision, and in fact, even before, is a vanguard of activists, students, and young people who have the desire to fight back against this attack. And they're mobilizing and organizing themselves in encouraging ways. And though the reaction to the decision may not have manifested in demonstrations of millions of people in the streets, there is a shift in consciousness that shows more and more people disillusioned with the Supreme Court and the institutions of the US, which have allowed the right to an abortion to disappear without a fight. Though they're not yet organized, a new generation of people is having this experience with the Democratic Party, and they know that they're not our allies, and we can't wait until November to try to win the right to an abortion. And it's this new generation, new political generation, that is shaped by the experience of the Trump administration, but also by the experience of the pandemic and BLM in 2020, who see reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights as intimately linked and want to put up a fight against all the reactionary policies of the right. But something that makes the situation even more dynamic is that many of these young people are, and it's a convoluted Venn diagram, of course, but many of these people are part of Generation U, as it's been called, and this recent upsurge in the labor movement. People who see unions favorably, see them as a place from which to fight for demands outside of their individual workplaces. Though their intervention isn't widespread, of course, you can't overestimate it. It is a powerful example and something promising of how the working class can intervene in this moment and link the struggles in their workplaces to fight against oppression. And it stands in contrast, of course, to the inaction of the biggest unions, who have done very little, almost absolutely nothing to mobilize their forces in defense of abortion. And so in light of all of that, how do we on the left, in the absence of a mass movement, but given this expanded group of people who want to fight, many of whom see unions, and more than that, our power as workers as a means of fighting for democratic rights, many of whom are open to the critiques of the Democrats and the system itself, how do we position ourselves? With the impending criminalization of abortion is just the first step. How do we build the movement that many of us are calling for, without fooling ourselves into thinking that with our forces, we can substitute ourselves for that movement. And obviously, like, I don't have sufficient answers to this, but I do want to pose some things for discussion. And rather than focus, get mired down and focus on particular like tactical questions, I want to propose, a perspective that's, I think, crucial for us to discuss amongst the left and rally around in terms of expanding the movement, building an independent socialist feminist pole of attraction, and uniting the struggles of the fight for reproductive rights, for the struggle for trans rights, with the promising developments in the labor movement. Because in the absence of a huge movement in the streets, there's a danger to fall into sort of a radical wing of the liberal logic of simply adapting to a post-Roe reality, one that in its more progressive form relies on everlasting resistance and mutual aid as a strategy, not tactics, as a strategy in and of itself for protecting abortion rights. And indeed, I think, like, as we've seen, much of the reaction to the overturn of Roe v. Wade and other of these attacks, like the Don't Say Gay bill and all of these things, have taken this form in an effort to sort of like do something now, to take hold of that effort to fight, right? Organizing networks for people, again, to get transport to abortion clinics, funds for abortions and abortion pills, et cetera. And I would argue that it is a central task for the left to resist this sort of logic and focus on pushing for a perspective to expand our tasks, to take up the political struggle that is at the heart of these attacks on democratic rights, and in doing so, expand the movement into a force that is actually capable of defending abortion and other rights, that can mobilize en masse to defend against all the attacks of the right. That's why the demand that many of our organizations are putting forward, that of making a law for free, safe abortion on demand, is so central, right? To organize that logic. And that's not to be dismissive of particular tactics or direct action at all. We need a variety of tactics and self-defense, but to resist viewing them, as I was saying, as a strategy in themselves, and to instead pose how these tactics and others can bring more people into the fight, into the streets, and how we can put forward a perspective of organizing independently in the places where we're strongest, namely in our workplaces, our schools, and that requires the efforts of the whole left. And for this, I would argue that we have to use the examples at our disposal, international examples, to show that mass movements work and they can win, and that socialists can play a crucial role in them. Just look at the fight for abortion rights in Argentina. This feminist movement organized protests of hundreds of thousands of people for the International Women's Strike, joined a global feminist movement that orchestrated massive mobilizations around the world. Young people occupied schools and organized their whole schools to come to the streets in the struggle. They organized in 10 minutes, okay. Massive feminist assemblies where people spoke, proposed, and voted steps forward for the movement, and socialists played a crucial role in this process. They put forward the need to call on unions to enter the struggle and mobilize their members to the streets. And we also talked about the need for organizing, real work stoppages, which union leaderships resisted, of course, tooth and nail. And so this is not to draw a false equivalency of these situations in two different times and places, or to oversimplify things, but to say that it's possible. And it's important to use these conclusions in our own fight. They're the kind of perspectives that we need to fight to put forward as socialists in the US around a common fighting program to combat the attacks of the right, and for the organization of the working class to do so. And I'm wrapping up in a bit. In this sense, even with our limited forces, just as one example, something that we've been talking a lot about in Left Voice is putting forward the logic of self-defense committees in the workplaces and schools to discuss how to organize independently and with the methods of the working class in defense of the right to an abortion. And in doing so, proposing a perspective to unite the struggles of this new wave of labor activism who are fighting in their workplaces to better their living conditions with those of the reproductive rights movement. And at the same time that we call for the defense of abortion rights and against the attacks on trans youth, we also call for the right to form a union in every workplace, for universal health care and a living wage, just as a couple of examples, right, as how to tie these things together. But of course, and here I'll wrap up, a program of defense of democratic rights, or just a mass movement independent of the bourgeois political parties and self-organization, isn't enough. In a context in which the social, economic, and political crises of the last several decades has created more space to put forward anti-capitalist politics and a critique of this wretched, awful system, we have to put forward a broader socialist feminist vision as well, one that explains why these rights are being taken away and provides a strategy to fight back. one that links these attacks on our bodily autonomy to the oppression of women and LGBTQ folks across the world at the hands of US imperialism, that links these attacks on reproductive rights to the systemic violence and racism against Black and brown people in the US and across the world, and one that paints a unified picture of capitalist oppression and exploitation of our bodies and proposes a vision of the necessity to fight back so that our futures can be in our hands. And it's in this political struggle among the left pushing for an independent and revolutionary perspective in what is ultimately a mixed movement for reproductive rights, for the protection of democratic rights, the discussion of a common program and strategy, and in a word, the discussion of forming a revolutionary party can emerge. And I'm just going to leave it there and drop that at the end and not go into it very much. But I hope it's something that we can talk more about in the discussion. So thanks so much. That's it.